Thanks very much, first of all, for joining us here and the first guest on hopefully a new series of podcasts where Craig Houston talks to. So thanks very much for being our first guest and coming along today. So to start off with, if you could maybe tell those who don't know who Paul Murray is, maybe just who you are, what you've done, and the stuff that all the Rangers fans will know, but just introduce yourself.
Sure. So, a qualified chartered accountant, but I quickly get into the investment business about 1989. And I joined a company called 3i, which was at the time was the biggest venture capital company in the UK. And actually, that's how I first met David Murray, because 3i had a shareholding in his holding company, and I looked after the investment. So I got to know him through that. Yeah. And then pretty much had a career in investment. And for the last 20 years, I've been doing my own thing with my own money and other people's. So, that's pretty much.
Yeah. And you mentioned you done work for the company that was had an ownership in David's company. That's how it worked. I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, your first involvement at Rangers was as a director under Sir David Murray's tenure. So that was started off through the business relationship. Would that be right?
Yes, I got to know at the time David's number two was a guy called Donald Wilson, who actually eventually went on to the Rangers board as well as David's representative. And what happened when I looked after the investment that we had in David's company, about 2000, I was actually working in London at the time, from about 2000 to about 2003. And I came back, obviously from Glasgow, but I came back to Edinburgh to work for a while, and I kind of caught up with David and Donald. And at the time, the club was looking to raise money. No surprise there. And this is 2003, and David had a couple of ideas how to get fresh capital into the club. And myself and four other guys put some money into the Rangers Youth Development system.
That,
And we formed this company. We put in some money, and it was actually a really good concept. The concept was to bring young players through from the academy and kind of use that funding to help do that. And then if the players made it into the first team, there'd be like a kind of recompense back to the youth development company to continue the process. So some of the players that come through, Alan McGregor was part of that, Charlie Adam, Stephen Smith,
Hutton,
Alan Hutton, John Fleck, who at the time John Fleck was about, I think John Fleck was about 14 at the time, actually.
Oh. And this was before you were a director?
Yeah, so I got involved. I got into the kind of getting involved there. I get involved in the kind of inner sanctum, I feel like. So, the board also had John Gregg and Sandy Jardine as directors, which was great to meet your kind of boyhood heroes. And it was really good, with all the meetings with Auchenhowie. It was good to get involved in the kind of running of the club a wee bit. Martin Bain was involved as well. And I guess from that sort of touch point, that was 2003, 2004, I kind of got to know people in the club, and then they invited me onto the main board in 2007.
So the youth company that you were involved with, who were the other people involved in that? Was there maybe 4 or 5 people from memory?
There was maybe 4 at the start, and it was 5 eventually. So the 4 at the start was myself, a guy called Ian Russell, who was quite well known to the club at the time. He was a kind of business associate of David's. There was a guy called Walter Nimmo, who was a very successful sort of pharmaceuticals guy, made money in sort of biotech. There was a guy called Ian Hart, who I think was subsequently involved in the club. And then a guy that you might know called Jimmy Whitelaw. So Jimmy was a publican, had done well and sold his pubs and had a bit of money. Jimmy's been around the club quite a long time. So it was those initial 4, and then Jimmy kind of joined in. So it was 5 in total. It was good. We all came from different backgrounds, different perspectives. And it was good I think we added some value to the club, and we made some suggestions. And, it was good to see the young players coming through, because obviously I think we're always fans. You kind of, although you want to see the big name signings, you want to see the boys coming through the academy. And obviously there's probably been not as many as we would have all liked to have happened. So to play a part in helping some of those guys come through, and then see people like Alan Hutton move on to Spurs and all the rest of it.
You see the careers some of them have away from Rangers as well. It was
pretty satisfying, and I still keep in touch with guys like Charlie Adam and stuff like that. So it was good.
So you done that for a few years then. Was it 2007?
2007,
And That was David Murray owned the club at the time, and how did that come about? I mean, was that just through the relationship you built up with the youth development?
Yeah, I was quite friendly with Martin Bain. So I think Martin, I had a lot of time for Martin, and people with different views, but I thought he did a pretty good job in the circumstances, and I think Martin saw me as a bit of a sounding board. So him and I were quite friendly, and he would bounce ideas off me and so on. And I think he kind of wanted a bit of fresh blood on the board and fresh ideas. Obviously, I came from an investment background. Also, at the time, we were looking at doing some stuff at the stadium that maybe I could help with. So, I think it was Martin that promoted it. And then, and because I knew David, so David Murray from previous relationship, I think he was quite comfortable with me as well. So I joined the board at that time. Obviously, Dave King was on the board as a big investor. So I got to know Dave quite well from that as well.
And I'd imagine working in a board with those types of characters would have been quite challenging.
Yeah, it was challenging. It was a different, the first experience. Well, actually, the first time there. So I was there from 2007 to 2011. So 4 years, and it was very much split in two separate periods. So 2007 to 9, we were very much, David's business was going really well, and the club was doing well. Walter was back. Everything was going well on the pitch. With a couple of disappointments, obviously. In fact, my first season was Manchester, so I'm thinking this is incredible.
You do this every year.
This is incredible, right? So, but ultimately disappointing is obviously we ended up only winning the 2 cups, and at one point we were on for the quadruple and so on. So but it was going well, in general. And then of course the whole kind of banking crisis hit in October 2008, and that continued from there. And I think that really impacted David's businesses. And that's when the bank started to get involved. So the second period, 2009 to 11, was when the real problems hit. And obviously we can talk more about it in a minute.
So back to Manchester. When did you travel down, and were you aware of what was happening in the rest of the country all coming to Manchester, or were you a wee bit in a bubble away from it all the time?
Not at all, no. I mean, I used to love the European trips because, apart from just going to different interesting cities, what I used to always do, I used to always sit beside the finance guy in the other club.
Yeah.
Used to have a pre-match director's lunch or dinner, and I would always sit beside him and try and find out things that they were doing differently from us and try and bring back some ideas. So in that season, I think we played 19 European games because we did the Champions League qualifiers. I think we beat Red Star Belgrade to qualify. Then in the group with Barcelona, Stuttgart and Lyon. Obviously Lyon and Barcelona were incredibly interesting. Spend time with the Barcelona guys, and it was incredible. And then we finished third, dropped into and then we had all the games up to Manchester. So it was a really, really great experience, especially my first season as director. But as regards Manchester, I mean, I think we look back on it. It was maybe a bit disappointing. No disrespect to Manchester, but you're expecting to go to like an exotic foreign country, and you're only driving, 3 hours down the M6. But no, I mean, I think it was a good experience. I think the team we're playing so many games, and the team was running on empty. And I kind of look back in that the final was a bit disappointed in the sense I didn't think we did ourselves justice. But as regards the whole thing, it was really great. We went down the day before. I think I arrived there. We're in a hotel quite close to the Granada TV studio. So all the directors were in that hotel. The players were actually staying outside Manchester in a sort of, I can't remember what it was called, but it's one of these sort of De Vere country golfing clubs. And we actually went back there after the game, and it was meant, well, it would either be a celebration or a bit of a commiseration. As it turned out, it was a commiseration. But the players were, I think everyone was down, but accepted it. But we were only walking distance into Manchester city centre, so we walked in. You could feel the whole thing building as the day went on. I have to say, I think the authorities made a mistake having a thing in the centre of Manchester. I think they should have moved the fans into a better area, because it was going to, obviously with the sun and the number of people were there, there was always going to be problems, I think, and that was a bit disappointing.
The whole day was just crazy. I get picked up sort of 5-6 in the morning at Strathclyde Park by a supporters bus that came from Fife, and the whole M6 was just like a car park.
Yeah.
And when you eventually did get into service stations, everyone was just a different party. It was just a phenomenal experience, something that I was brought up in the stories of Barcelona. I was born 9 months after Barcelona, which thankfully my dad wasn't at the game. My grandfather was, or I might have considered a DNA test. And, been brought up in the stories of my gran being at the game and whatever. I just didn't think I would be fortunate enough to be as one in my lifetime, and now we've been at 2.
Yeah.
So the occasion got me. I can't remember a thing about the game.
Yeah.
I remember being there. I remember walking in. And the only thing I can remember about the game was Novo snatching at one from about 6 yards out, and there was someone close in front of him. And I've never watched the game back. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I've got my memories of the day. But it was a phenomenal time.
It's funny. I mean, I obviously Seville last year was a great experience. I can look at the two things differently. In the sense that I was just kind of happy to be in Manchester.
I know what you're going to say.
In the sense that we would never expected to be in there.
Yeah.
But in Seville, I went expecting to win.
100%.
And I was even more disappointed after Seville. So I really thought, I actually thought it was written in the stars. 150 years, 25 years since 9 in a row.
Yeah.
All the various milestones. I just thought we were going to win.
Yeah.
I really did.
Yeah, and bar the width of a post or the width of a stud, it could have been a different story. But that's football, unfortunately. So you get appointed the Rangers director. What's that phone call like?
First of all, even when I got involved in the youth development thing, and I was going to the Blue Room and had a seat in the director's box. It was, it's a great experience, and you kind of. I think the thing about anyone that ever gets involved in the club, whether you play for the club or whether you get involved in some other capacity, especially if you've been a fan of the club, I think everyone would say, and I know that you guys have got ex-players on here as well, the feeling never leaves you. The club, it really is a special club. I know everyone says that about their own club, but it's an institution, and you kind of feel when you walk up the marble staircase. I mean, even now, I walk up, I still get the hairs on the back of my neck go up, and you see all the history and the number of people that have been involved, and you're just a small person getting through history, trying to do your bit to help the club. So it's a great feeling. Quite a funny story. I remember, unfortunately, my dad was still alive, but he couldn't make my first game for some reason when I joined the board. So I invited my business partner at the time, and he was disinterested in football completely. And so he came along. He's like, I'm quite keen to bring someone with me. And we're standing in the Blue Room, and I suddenly saw John Gregg, who's my hero. And I regard John as the ultimate Ranger, So I see John, and he comes over, Paul, how's it going? And he knows my name and all that. And I said to Glenn, this is John Gregg. And Glenn says, so what do you do at the club, Mr. Gregg? So apart from playing 750 games.
Being a manager, being a director.
Exactly.
Aye, apart from all that.
Exactly.
It must have been some. And what happened? I mean, does David Murray phone you? Does he say, can you come in with a word? I want you to be a director.
Yeah, what happened was, so obviously I was involved through the Rangers youth development, but in the actual director call, so I was during the summer of 2007. So Walter had just come back in the January, and also preparing for the new season. And I was actually in Spain on holiday, and I'd come back for a couple of days to do some business, and I was in my house down the Borders at the time, and my phone went. It was Martin Bain, and so I took the phone call, and he was actually, so I'm going to put you in speakerphone. I'm actually with David Murray, and he said, David, and David's one of these guys. He doesn't really muck about with introductions. He's just straight in, right? I tell you what, how do you fancy being a director? And it was that kind of conversation, and it took a wee bit of time because I would appoint a couple of other people to executive roles. So I wanted to announce everything at the same time. So it took until the September, I think, before that was July when the phone call came in. But it took to probably September before it was all announced. Yeah. And in fact, then the very first game after being appointed was Lyon away.
Wow.
We won 3-0 over Lyon.
So did you take long to come to your decision?
About 10 nanoseconds.
And then you had to keep. I take it you had to keep.
I had to keep quiet. Yeah, keep quiet. And then that was really difficult. Obviously, told my close friends and family, but it was quite difficult. I mean, it wasn't as much, I guess, social media in those days. So maybe I can keep these things quiet a bit longer.
So at that time, What was the debt at Rangers at the time? Was it about 40 million level? Was it past that?
Yeah,
Was
I think it was about. It may have been about 35 to 40. I think from memory. Yeah,
and from then until Craig Whyte took over, it came down to, was it about 18? Would that be right?
it was 18 when Craig Whyte took over the club. I mean, so what we did is, I mentioned before, that it was two very distinct periods. So the first period when David was still chairman, before all the kind of banking issues, it was very much, we were still, spending money, buying players. And then when David stepped down in 2009 and Alistair Johnson took over, it was a bit more of an independent club from the Murray Group. So the board was a bit more in charge of decision making. Up until that point, David was still the majority shareholder. So the strategy after that was very much to try and get the debt down. But the way of doing that was to qualify for the Champions League, and so we managed to win the league all those years. I think 2009, 2010, 2011, we won the league in each of those years, qualify for the Champions League, but still got the debt down, because at that point, and it was still the case then, still the case now, the Champions League money is still a massive game changer in terms of the finances of the club,
And David had meant, was it probably 2 years before Craig Whyte came along that he publicly said he was willing to sell Rangers? Would that be a bit right? So
if I started, so obviously, I mean, David's never really said it, I think, publicly, but the Bank of Scotland were really keen to see the club sold, and obviously they've been taken over by that stage by Lloyd's, and they were a kind of London-based bank, no affiliation really with Rangers or Scotland, and probably took a far dispassionate position than Bank of Scotland may have taken. So they were very keen to get the debt down, see the club sold on. And the first guy that appeared, you might remember, was a guy called Andrew Ellis. So he appeared in the scene about 2009, early 2010, floated around the thing for a while, and then nothing really happened. There was a guy on the board by that stage called Donald Muir. So Donald Muir was the bank's representative, and he was keen to obviously see the club sold. So Andrew went away, and then it was actually towards the end of 2010. So the first time I ever heard Craig Whyte's name mentioned was in December of 2010. So he went to Bursaspor for a Champions League game in Turkey. I always remember it was that really cold winter here. It was horrendous snow from the November to the March.
I remember it.
And it was even snowing in Turkey. So we went in Turkey, and it was we had to divert. It was horrendous conditions. So we went there in early December to play the last Champions League game against Bursaspor. And Alistair Johnson was on the trip. He was the chairman at the time. Took us all aside and said, "Look, we've had this proposal from a guy called Craig Whyte." Gave us the outline of it, and that was the first time I heard Craig Whyte's name.
Never heard of him before.
Never heard of him before.
And then you start making phone calls, do you?
Yeah.
And so who's this guy? Did you find anything out before the horror stories came out?
Well, I mean, what we found out was obviously didn't make great reading, but it was hard to find out too much. And at that point, David was an 83% shareholder, so he was selling his shares, so it was his deal. To be fair to David Murray, I mean, took a bit of pressure from Alistair. I mean, I have to give Alistair Johnson a bit of credit. He pushed to get the club to have a say in, or at least to see the terms of the deal and have some kind of say in the sale process. And David eventually agreed to that. So Alistair got involved. He met Craig Whyte. I remember we then had a meeting, and it was something like the 31st of March, I think it was, of 2011. He actually ended up buying the club on the 5th of May, so maybe about 6 weeks before he bought the club. We, the board, eventually got to meet Craig Whyte formally, so we went to his lawyer's offices in Glasgow. I think it was the 31st of March.
So was that a criminal lawyer he had at the time?
And no comment. And it was quite funny because there was like 10 of us on one side of the table and Craig Whyte on the other side, and he was pretty nervous, as you would be, obviously, and we'd all kind of submitted some questions we wanted to ask him, and obviously every questions were different. You know, John Gregg's asking questions about players and, you know, things of that nature. John McClelland, who's on the board, was asking. So we all asked slightly different, given their backgrounds. So I said to him, you know, we're roughly the same age. You've worked in London in finance. I've worked in London in finance. It's quite a close, it's quite a small market. You know, a lot of expat Scots. Do you know A, B, and C? Oh, Paul, I don't really know those guys, but you know, I've heard of them, and then that was a bit of a strange thing because you know you would know these people, and then I said to him, so you know, I've made investments, good, bad, indifferent. What investments have you made in different? Give us some idea of the companies you're interested in. What companies have you bought? And he said, well, I don't really buy companies. What I do is, it was all very vague. And for a guy like me who's pretty experienced in finance, this doesn't sound right. So I remember we left the meeting. He was actually a nice enough guy. He was a nice enough guy and he friendly and civil, but we left the meeting thinking, this is so kind of vague and, you know, where's the money coming from and all the rest of it. So I think we all left that meeting. I mean, we had a short debrief, and I think all of us were pretty concerned, you know. And
6 weeks later, he's got the keys.
Yeah, got the keys. Yeah.
The one thing about that time, and I didn't know at the time, but looking back 6 months after admin eventually hit, I call it the Reservoir Dogs photograph, where he was walking along Edmondson Drive, the first game in charge, and I think it was Hearts we played.
That's a home.
And when you look back at the photograph, 4 or 5 of the characters in day one with him were the administrators that put us into admin 12 months later.
Yeah.
It just stank when you actually take a step back and you stop being a fan. It just cross your fingers and hoping for the best here.
Yeah.
And you actually started looking at it. It was just horrific.
Yeah.
And then again, you excuse the ignorance with timeline because we're talking about 10 odd years ago, and you can sometimes forget. Had you publicly said something before he got the keys, or was that after he got the keys? Because I know there was a falling out.
So what I did was, I was probably the most vocal critic, and so I went public in probably the middle of April. So just about 2 weeks after that first meeting, and I gave a couple of interviews. Jim Traynor actually was at the Record at the time, and I just said what I thought, and I think I actually said, my fear is that it's going to lead to administration in 12 months' time. And then the most, I suppose, critical interview I gave was on the 3rd of May. It was second or third, the Monday of that week. So I think he got the keys on the Thursday night, Friday morning, or maybe Friday night. On the Monday of that week, so let's say it was the 2nd or 3rd of May, I can't remember. I gave an interview, I think, to the Record, and I said what I thought. I didn't think it was the right deal. I thought administration was going to be the result. Because the problem we had was that we had this underlying tax issue, which, you know, any person who has ever bought a company, why would you buy a company with a tax liability? You know, you wouldn't buy it.
There's uncertainty.
So there's something else he's looking at, and the only way out of it, apart from negotiating a deal with HMRC, which I always thought would be really difficult, would be to put the club into some form of insolvency. And obviously, from a fan's point of view, I didn't think that was right. And then,
So you've said some bad things about a guy that's just about to get the keys and own 83% of the club.
Yeah.
The writing was kind of on the wall, is it not?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So what happened was, just briefly, as you say, his first game was the Hearts home game on a Saturday, which I think won 2-1. So the Reservoir Dogs picture, he then came into the boardroom, and in those days we used to have the directors in the old boardroom at Ibis, the one beside the manager's office, smaller one. Now everyone's in the blue room. So we're in there, I mean, you're going to be civil, obviously, and, you know, congratulations and all that. So he came in, I remember he came in with his dad, actually, and we were all standing there, Martin, myself, John McClelland, John Gregg, David wasn't there. And I remember, actually, that John Gregg, who, as I said, is my hero, he said, he just whispered, he goes, Paul, look at his shoes. And I looked down at his shoes, and you know, I'm not the world's greatest dresser, obviously, as you can see today, but, you know, if you're buying Rangers, you're going to be absolutely forefront of media attention and Sky Sports and BT Sport and all this kind of stuff. And especially that day, you're just a new owner of this massive club.
Yeah.
And so you'd be out getting a Hugo Boss suit and,
Yeah.
everything. Your shoes would be, you see your faces, you could see your face in your shoes. And he was wearing like plastic pointed shoes and, kind of threadbare suit and all that kind of stuff. And it just didn't quite equate with somebody who had just bought
pretending they've got
a massive football club,
Yeah. So how long did you last until we decided they didn't want Paul Murray there?
What happened then was, I didn't have any kind of, there was no doubt I was going to be going amongst other people. But what actually happened was, so that was a Saturday. And then the following Sunday was the game at Kilmarnock when we actually won the league.
Yeah, I remember it well.
So I had contacted Dave King in the week before the Kilmarnock game.
So is Dave still on the board at this time?
So Dave's still on the board, and David said because Dave had an investment in the club, Dave was going to stay on obviously to try and protect his investment. So Dave was the one guy who would definitely be staying on, and obviously the rest of us were a bit up in the air. So I'd contacted Dave to say, look, Dave, just let you know I'm going to resign after the Kilmarnock game, and I actually drafted and sent to him a resignation letter. And he said, look, don't be too hasty. Let's meet before the Kilmarnock game. So we actually all met, the board, apart from Craig Whyte. We met, and it was still that kind of transitional period where he was taking over the club, and he hadn't quite. Well, he probably joined the board, but it was a new company and all that. So we met as the old board on the morning before the game. Kilmarnock game was at midday, I think it was, and we met at 10 o'clock in the morning at Ibrox. And Dave said, look, it's really important we all stay together here because we want to make sure that the club's protected and we get assurances, and because he'd made some promises about funding and all this kind of stuff. So it's very important we all just stay together. Let's just, at the very least, make sure that he does the things he says he's going to do, and then after that, you want to resign, then resign. So probably against my better judgment, I said, okay, I'll go with that, Dave. That's fine. So we had to come on again. That was fine, and that was the end of the season. And then quite a funny story. So in something like 2 weeks later, it would be the 24th of May or something. Monday, season's finished. We're in the Scottish Cup final, so that season had finished. Martin and Donald McIntyre was the finance. I mentioned Donald was the finance guy. They were working with Craig and his team to get the new arrangements together and get things set up for the new regime. And the Sunday before that Monday, an email pops in at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, and it just says, and it's from Craig Whyte's lawyer, a guy called what was his name again? He actually passed away. Gary Whyte. So yes, Gary Whyte was his lawyer who died in pretty some mysterious circumstances. But he sent out this email as the company secretary, a new company secretary, saying it just said agenda. That's all it said in the email. So it's like 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. So I'm going to bed. So open up the no. It says sorry for the late email. Can we have a board meeting tomorrow at 10 o'clock, at 5 o'clock in the evening UK time on the Monday? So and it just says agendas. So I open up the agenda, and it's just got one item in the agenda, and it just says the future. so I actually called Martin Bain and said, I'm pretty sure what's coming next, and we're not part of the future. So anyway, fast forward the following day, we have this board meeting, and it's one of these ones. It was days before Zoom, so we're calling in on a dodgy conference line. So I'm phoning in from Edinburgh. Martin Bain was actually with Walter, Ali, and Ian Durant on a charity thing in New York. So he's popped out of a restaurant in Fifth Avenue at 5 o'clock, midday US time. Alistair's phoning in from Ohio on a dodgy line, and he's out in the golf course somewhere. I think John Gregg, John McClelland, Donald McIntyre, and Martin were actually at Ibrox with Craig Whyte and Gary Whyte, and Dave King couldn't make it for some reason. And so the board meeting starts, and Craig Whyte is incredibly nervous. I mean, literally, you could just tell he was really, really nervous. And he tried to crack a couple of jokes, and it was just like silence, and the whole thing was so tense. And Gary Whyte then steps in, and obviously in a very legalistic way, he says, right, first of all, we've certain matters brought to attention. We're going to summarily dismiss Martin Bain and Donald McIntyre for gross misconduct. And furthermore, although Paul Murray and Alistair Johnson aren't employees or of the club, we were going to terminate them. It was a slightly odd phrasing. It was terminate their positions. So it was silence for a minute, and of course, Martin's in New York.
Wow.
So I wasn't happy to actually in New York, and it's really dodgy lines. Everyone's it's all this background noise, taxis, and wind whistling and all that. So Martin said, "Sorry, did you say gross misconduct? What did you say? Gross misconduct?" And of course, the whole thing just degenerated into a slanging match, wow. and that was it. And the whole thing lasted 5 minutes, and we were all fired. And then the following day, it was the front page of the newspapers, the night of the long knives, and this kind of stuff. That's
because obviously everybody knew the story. Paul Murray's not here, and X, Y, and Z have left, but you never really know how these things delivered. How does that work? So you're away, and that's probably what 9-10 months before admin eventually hits, and you're unfortunately correct with your guess about it the year before. I remember where I was. I remember distinctly how that day panned out. Where were you, and how did the news get to you?
Well, just briefly before that, there was quite a few things. So I kept in touch with. I was off the board, and then obviously Martin and Donald were off the board, and then John McClellan said to John Gregg in October, "This is so dodgy. We need to get off the board now, John, as well." So the two of them left. So at that point, there was nobody left from the old board. Apart from Dave King, who was obviously looking at, and Dave was, really pressing for information, and Dave being Dave, been really diligent and all the rest of it, and sort of chasing every point. And then I had kept in touch with Dave right through the process, and then just out the blue, and this is a pretty interesting story. So we Donald McIntyre had been working on the sort of tax position with HMRC, trying to sort that out, and there was two cases. It was a so-called small tax case, or the wee tax case, and the big tax case. And so Donald had a pretty good relationship with the guys at HMRC. They surprisingly wanted to see me and Donald, although we weren't directors, and so we met them kind of off the record almost, and they just started to talk about some issues. They couldn't get into too many details. They said, that's about various things, how we accounted for things at the club and all that. And you just get the sense that they were concerned, And then you fast forward to the November, bear in mind that admin was in the February, Valentine's Day. I got a phone call from the inspector at HMRC, and bear in mind that I'm not on the board, Yep. So look, we're really concerned here. We don't want to be blamed for this because, actually, Rangers is a big institution in Scotland. There's a lot of things going on at the club that we're not happy with, and can you help us? I said, well, look, I'm not involved here, but I can put you in touch with Dave King, who's the director. So, cut a long story short, we have a meeting at the end of January, and to keep it really formal, we have it in my lawyer's office in Edinburgh. So I'm in the lawyer's office with the two guys from HMRC, and Dave King's on a conference line from Johannesburg, and so to keep it right, HMRC, we can show you certain documents, and can you communicate these to Dave King? And you then start to see the whole unraveling of the season ticket this thing.
Yep.
And I'm just sitting there horrified, as if we have actually sold £27 million of forward season tickets to fund this deal.
Yeah, to fund the purchase.
And that's, we're basically bust. But how can we possibly pay that back? You've actually mortgaged your future without any. And then so Dave was obviously horrified as well.
And this is about November.
No, that was it started in November. That meeting was just before the end of January, so 2 weeks before.
Yeah.
And so I said to HMRC, "What do you want us to do with this?" They said, we actually want to make it public, so that we're not getting blamed. We wanted to make it clear to everyone what's going on here. So we did that. It came out in I think the newspapers the following day. That was probably the end of January. And Craig Whyte, you might remember, poo-pooed the whole thing, and he banned the newspapers and a lot of rubbish. The whole thing's not right, and I'm going to sue people and all that. And then, of course, 2 weeks later,
obviously, it's you get into territory of what you can and can't talk about, because that man eventually went to court and was charged basically for an illegal purchase, which was included getting the money off Ticketus, and he hawked the club to buy the club. So we need to be careful how we maybe talk about that going forward. I've got my views, and I suppose O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in a court of law, so you need to bear that in mind when you're talking about Craig Whyte. But it was ridiculous, wasn't it? And how did HMRC know about that?
They knew about it because of the VAT invoices. So when you account for VAT, as you know, there's two sides of VAT. There's what you gather in from customers, you pay over, and the person paying the VAT can reclaim the VAT. Yeah. So there's a mismatch between the two sides.
Wow.
That's how they discovered it.
So 2 weeks later, you find it officially, or did you know before? I mean, obviously, to man your knowledge and insight about business, you would have thought, writings on the wall here, this is only going to end one way. But when did you find out officially that's it? Was it the 14th, like everyone else?
It was the 14th, yeah.
And where were you at that time? Can you remember?
I was actually skiing in France on a family holiday, and I don't know if I ever told. You may have heard the story that my house was actually broken into. I
was going to ask you about that. Was that before or after that?
Actually happened. That happened. So I'm pretty sure the 14th of February, was it 2012? Was a Tuesday, and on the Sunday, the early hours of Monday morning, so the 13th of February, the day before, I get a phone call in France saying someone's broken into your house.
Just when you were living down the borders.
Aye. Yeah. And then I then met when I came back, obviously everything secure, nothing gone missing, alarm getting off, all fine. Continued the holiday, and we'll come back to the administration in a minute. But I came back, I met the police officer. He wasn't a football fan. He was an ordinary guy, and he was just bewildered. He goes, I can't actually kind of get my head around this. He said, these people have spent a lot of time. They spent a lot of time into your house. They've made no damage to getting in. Most people just smash the window and go in. If the alarm goes off, they grab the first thing they can get, and that's the end of it. He said, these people have spent a lot of time, taking out a pane of glass, placing it down, carefully, not to break it, going in, the alarm goes off, and then they don't take anything. He said it's kind of unheard of, in my world. He said, normally just grab an iPad or grab something of some value and then just scrap it. So he said... And he said to me, it's almost as if someone was trying to put something into your house. And
was there nothing missing?
No, there's nothing missing, and there was nothing in the house either. So it was all a bit strange. Maybe it was coincidental, I don't know, but it was all a bit strange.
And this is the day before admin?
This is the early hours of Monday morning, the day before admin, yeah.
Wow. Can I, again, memory sometimes blurs things. Did it end up getting swept for bugs or something like that? Was that another story? Was that another
time? Well, what he said to me, I said, what do you advise I do? He said, he then said to me, it's almost as if someone's trying to put something into your house. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, could be a bug, could be anything else. He said, I said, what would you advise I do? He said, well, I'd advise you to get the house swept. So I did do that. There was nothing there. So it might just have been a coincidence. I don't know, but obviously the timing of it was crazy in terms of the...
Aye. I mean, it's not my podcast getting interviewed here, but I've certainly had, at my time, 2012 onwards, some strange things that you think, is that coincidence? No. But it does seem... I mean, I remember you were abroad, I think it was one winter, maybe New Year, and a Rangers fan sent me a photograph of your house flooded, and I didn't even know where you lived at the time. And you were abroad, and I've sent you this photograph, and it was because your house was quite secluded. It was out. You didn't have a next door neighbour for miles.
It wasn't even that secluded, but it was certainly in the middle of the country, and it was actually on the River Tweed.
Yeah.
So it was out in the country. It was quite close to the local town, Galashiels, but it was certainly, it was certainly isolated. Put it that way.
Yeah, it's for somebody to put that much effort in to not be disturbed.
And we never had any problem. I was there for 14 years, never a single problem apart from that.
Strange. Didn't have any stalkers at the time, no?
Well, not to my knowledge, but never say never.
There wasn't a bunny boiling in the pot at the end of it. There was none of that carry on.
I can certainly...
So, we're in admin, right? You're out the way and still get associated. Did you have any dealings with Duff and Phelps?
A lot of dealings, yeah. So we tried to buy the club. So we had Douglas Park was there at the time. Douglas, myself, John, that's when I first met. I met John Bennett. I met John Bennett the following year. So not in the administration process, but Douglas Park. There was a guy called Brian Kennedy who I've got a lot of time for. Brian, he then sort of took over. He obviously had more money than the rest of us. Obviously, he tried to help. He kind kind of came from a Rangers fan. He wasn't a massive Rangers fan, but he came from a Rangers family, and he wanted to help. So he tried to help.
Was there not one time in the process where Brian Kennedy believed he had done enough to own Rangers?
Well, the night before Charles Green bought the club, and we had never heard of Charles Green at this point in time. Brian took over the discussions with Duff and Phelps, and they said to him, "Look, we'll deal with you." He said, "But you need to get Craig Whyte's consent to sell the club because he owned the way the thing was structured. I can't remember exact details. Craig Whyte had to consent to the shares being transferred,
even while the company's an admin."
Yeah. So on the previous Sunday, so this is maybe 2 weeks before Charles Green bought the club, Brian Kennedy flew to. In fact, actually, a week before Charles Green bought the club, the previous Sunday, Brian Kennedy flew to Inverness to Craig Whyte's castle, and he met with Craig Whyte, and Craig Whyte said, "I'll sell you the shares on one condition, and that's that Paul Murray's not involved." So Craig,
strange condition.
Brian phoned me Brian was then flying to America in his private jet, having flown done a detour to Inverness, and he said, "Look, this is the situation." I said, "Look, Brian, obviously I'm disappointed to hear that," and I said, "But I'll support you all the way. If you buy the club, that's my main thing. If I'm not involved, no problem."
So let me get this right though. The club, the business is an admin.
Yeah.
Craig Whyte's put us into admin.
Yeah.
And he's deciding that they'll let the administrators sell it to Kennedy with his terms.
Yeah.
It's a bizarre situation.
I can't remember if there was a technical. It was legal. The way it had been put together, I can't actually just quite remember the exact reason. It was something to do with the shares in. It was a holding company, and I can't remember the exact reason. Anyway, it needed his consent.
Wow.
So that point, so that's fine. So Brian then flies to America that week. This is a week that Charles Green buys the club, and then I'm keeping in touch with Brian Kennedy, who's in negotiations with Duff and Phelps. And then on the Thursday night, the night before Charles Green buys the club on the Friday, Brian called me from New York or New York Airport saying, "I've just spoken to Paul Clark, one of the administrators, and basically I've said to him, do I fly to Manchester where he lives, or do I fly to Glasgow to do the deal with you?" And Paul Clark's told me to fly to Glasgow. We're doing the deal tomorrow. I said, "Great." So I'll pick you up at Glasgow Airport. We'll go to Ibrox and go from there. So I picked Brian up on the Friday morning. We drive into Ibrox. We're waiting just to get news, and then Brian gets a phone call, and he comes off the call and says, "That's Paul Clark. They've sold the club to a consortium led by Charles Green." So
taking your fans hat off for a minute, and just and the fact that you were involved in one of the two offers, from a totally finance and business point of view, the Kennedy bid made more sense.
Well, I think it made more sense in the sense that he was a guy that how can I put it? He was doing it for the right reasons. He wasn't doing it to make money.
Yeah.
He didn't want to lose money necessarily, but he didn't want to make money. He came from a Rangers family. He had been involved in sport, before. In fact, he was still
Sale
Sharks, and he'd done a couple of other things. So he was really interested in sport, investing in sport. He's very friendly with Graham Souness. So part of the thing was to bring Graham back in some capacity. I think in terms of the custodianship of the club, he would have been a good owner. And so that's why I kind of backed his.
Yeah, but even if your job is administrator and your job is to look after the future of this company and the best interests of the people with money, did Brian's deal make more sense than the?
I think so. I didn't see Charles Green's deal in detail, but if as reported it was 5.5 million, then there was no difference really. So if that was the only difference from what I could see, I would have thought that Brian's bid was better because from a fan point of view, he was a better custodian.
And knowing what Brian Kennedy had to go through, which you've just told me about, to get Craig Whyte to agree, that he could buy the club. Charles Green must have been through the same.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I think that was the very clear position that you needed Craig Whyte's agreement to do the CVA.